There is a building in southern Spain where Roman stone, Islamic arches, and a Christian cathedral all occupy the same space. Above you, Renaissance vaults. Around you, a forest of more than 800 red and white arches raised by a Muslim caliphate. Beneath the floor, the traces of older Christian-era buildings, and beneath those, the footprint of Rome. Locals call it the Mezquita. 1,000 years ago, the city around this building was one of the largest and most learned cities in Western Europe. It was a city where Muslims, Jews, and Christians lived side by side, built a golden age together, and then watched it come apart. This is not a fairy tale about tolerance. It is something more useful, a true story about how coexistence actually gets built, what it costs, and how it can be lost. Jerusalem shows what happens when three faiths fight over one holy ground. Córdoba shows what happens when they share one city instead. This is the entire history of Córdoba, and it begins long before Islam existed, with soldiers of Rome on a riverbank. Chapter 1. Rome on the Guadalquivir. Every great city begins with a decision about water. Paris chose an island. Boston chose a harbor. Córdoba grew at the point where a wide, slow river changes its nature. Stand on the southern bank of the Guadalquivir, sometime in the 2nd century before the birth of Christ, and you can see the logic with your own eyes. Downstream from this point, the river runs deep enough to carry serious boat traffic toward the Atlantic. Upstream, it grows shallow and unreliable. And right here, the crossing is manageable. Goods moving between the mineral-rich mountains of the interior and the ports of the coast pass through this stretch of the valley, or they travel a long way around. Control this stretch, and you sit on one of the great doorways of Spain. The Romans understood this immediately, because the Romans understood rivers the way bankers understand money. The man credited with founding Roman Córdoba was a general named Marcus Claudius Marcellus. Sometime around 169 years before the birth of Christ, though the ancient sources disagree on the details, and some historians place the formal founding a generation later. What matters is what the city became. Not a frontier outpost, a capital. Córdoba rose to be the leading city of its region, and later, under the Emperor Augustus, the capital of Boeotia, one of the wealthiest provinces in the Roman world. It was wealthy for a reason that would make a modern economist smile: olive oil. The valley of the Guadalquivir produced olive oil on an industrial scale, and Rome consumed oil the way our world consumes petroleum. Oil for cooking, oil for lamps, oil for bathing, oil for medicine. Ships loaded at the river ports of Boeotia carried millions of clay jars of Spanish oil to the capital of the empire. In Rome today there is an entire artificial hill, called Monte Testaccio, built almost completely out of the broken pieces of discarded oil jars. Archaeologists studying the stamps on those fragments have found that an enormous share of them came from this one Spanish river valley. Somewhere in that hill, very likely, is clay that was shaped within sight of Córdoba. So the first identity of this city was not spiritual. It was commercial. Keep that in mind, because Córdoba will change religions more than once in this story. And through every change, The river traffic and the oil and the wheat keep moving. In this city, faith was always built on top of freight. But Córdoba did not just export oil. It exported minds. And here the pattern that will define Córdoba for 2,000 years appears for the first time. This provincial city, far from the center of power, kept producing people who taught the center of power how to think. A wealthy family living in Córdoba produced the man we know as Seneca the Elder, a scholar of rhetoric. His son, Seneca the Younger, born in Córdoba shortly before the birth of Christ, became one of the most influential philosophers Rome ever produced, a leading voice of Stoicism, and the personal tutor of the Emperor Nero. His writings on anger, on mercy, and on the shortness of life are still bestsellers today. More than 19 centuries after his death, when a modern American reads Seneca on a phone during a lunch break, they are reading Córdoba's first great export of ideas. The story of Seneca also carries the first dark lesson of this city. Serving power is dangerous. In the year 65, his former student, Nero, accused him of conspiracy and ordered him to take his own life. Seneca obeyed. In the Roman manner. The historian Tacitus, writing a generation later, describes him dictating his final thoughts to his secretaries as he died. Córdoba's greatest Roman son was destroyed by the empire he had helped to govern. Hold on to that pattern. It will not be the last time Córdoba's brightest mind is punished by the power he served. His nephew Lucan, also born in Córdoba, became one of Rome's celebrated poets, and was forced into suicide by the same emperor in the same year, before his 26th birthday. One provincial family, two of the most famous deaths in Roman literature. The city itself learned about Roman violence directly. During the civil wars of the 1st century before Christ, Córdoba backed the sons of Pompey against Julius Caesar. In the year 45 before Christ, after his victory nearby at the Battle of Munda, Caesar's forces took the city, and the ancient account of the Spanish War reports a massacre of its inhabitants. The number given in that source is enormous, and like most casualty figures from ancient warfare, it cannot be verified. What is certain is that Córdoba was punished severely, then rebuilt and repopulated with Roman veterans, and taught a lesson the city never fully forgot. In a war between giants, a rich city is not a player, it is a prize. Rebuilt Córdoba flourished for centuries. Templars, a theatre, aqueducts, and above all, the bridge. The Romans threw a stone bridge across the Guadalquivir at this crossing, and a bridge has stood on that spot ever since. The structure you can walk across today has been repaired and rebuilt many times over 2,000 years. So the stones have changed. The crossing has not. In 2026, you can walk it in about 4 minutes. Following the same line over the same river that Roman oil merchants, Visigothic farmers, Muslim caliphs, Jewish scholars and Christian kings all followed before you. Through every siege and every change of faith in this story, that crossing is the one constant character. As the Roman Empire weakened, Córdoba produced one more remarkable figure, and he points at where this story is going. A bishop of Córdoba named Hosius became one of the most influential Christian leaders of his age. a trusted advisor to the Emperor Constantine, the first Roman emperor to embrace Christianity. Hosius traveled from this Spanish river town to take a leading role at the Council of Nicaea in the year 325. The assembly that produced the first version of the creed that Christians, in a later revised form, still recite in churches across America and Europe every Sunday. A man from Córdoba stood at the center of the room where that statement of faith was hammered out. Then Rome fell, slowly and untidily, the way empires actually fall. Germanic peoples crossed into Spain in the early 400s, and the political map of the peninsula broke into pieces and kept moving for the better part of 2 centuries. For a period in the 1500s by our reckoning, no, let us be exact. For a period in the 500s, the emperors in Constantinople even held territory along the southern Spanish coast. And southern cities changed hands more than once. Córdoba itself was not securely part of the Visigothic kingdom until the king Leovigild took it by force around the year 572. The city rebelled against Visigothic authority more than once, and held out for years at a time, which tells you something about its stubborn sense of its own importance. Under Visigothic rule, on the flat ground near the river where the Mezquita stands today, there stood a Christian complex, traditionally identified as the Basilica of San Vicente. Archaeologists digging beneath the mosque in the 20th century found mosaics and structures from this earlier era, though exactly what the complex looked like and how it was used remains genuinely debated among scholars. Remember San Vicente, remember the bridge, because by the year 700, the Visigothic kingdom had a problem at the top. Kings were elected, then overthrown. Rival factions of nobles fought over the throne in cycles of conspiracy and revenge, while the people who actually worked the river valley watched and waited. Spain was rich, disorganized, and led by men who feared each other more than they feared the outside world. 4,000 kilometers to the east, in cities most people in Córdoba had never heard of. A new faith had swept out of Arabia and built an empire at a speed with few parallels in history. By the early 700s, it had already reached the Atlantic coast of Morocco. From the shore of North Africa, on a clear day, its soldiers could see Spain. The distance across the water is 14 kilometers. The Visigothic kingdom would not survive the crossing. What came next was not supposed to create one of the most brilliant cities in Europe. It began, like so much of this story, with an exile running for his life. Chapter 2. The Last Umayyad. In the summer of the year 750, a young man stood near the Euphrates River in Syria and watched horsemen coming to kill him. His name was Abd al-Rahman. He was around 20 years old, and he was a prince of the Umayyad dynasty, the family that had ruled the entire Islamic world for nearly a century, from Spain in the west to the borders of India in the east. Or rather, the family that had ruled it until a few months earlier, because in 750, a revolution led by a rival family, the Abbasids, swept the Umayyads from power, and the Abbasids did not believe in leaving loose ends. What followed was one of the most thorough dynastic exterminations in recorded history. Umayyad princes were hunted down across the empire. According to accounts preserved by later Arab historians, one group of surviving Umayyads was invited to a banquet of reconciliation and killed at the table. The stories from this purge are so dark that historians debate how much is fact and how much is Abbasid theatre. But the essential outcome is not in doubt. Within a few years, the family that had ruled tens of millions of people had been reduced to corpses, prisoners, and a tiny handful of fugitives. Abd al-Rahman was one of the fugitives. The chronicles tell us that when the killers found his hiding place near the Euphrates, he ran for the river and swam for his life. His younger brother, who hesitated in the water and turned back when the soldiers promised mercy, was killed on the bank. Abd al-Rahman kept swimming. These details come from chroniclers writing generations after the events, and his escape became legend almost immediately, which means the specifics were polished in the telling, but the outline is solid history. A single Umayyad prince escaped the destruction of his house, crossed the width of the known world as a hunted man, and reappeared years later and 4,000 kilometers away, at the far western edge of the earth. Think about what that journey meant. He had no state behind him, no standing army, no treasury of his own. He had a price on his head, because the new Abbasid Caliphate wanted the last Umayyad found. What he did have was a small circle of loyal followers. Above all, a freedman named Badr, who scouted the road ahead of him. And one more asset that turned out to matter. His mother was a Berber woman from North Africa. The refugee prince of Damascus was, on his mother's side, a son of the very lands he was now fleeing through, and Berber communities sheltered him on the way west. That double identity, Arab and Berber, Eastern and Western, would open doors that were closed to almost anyone else. Because at the end of the known world there was one place where an Umayyad name was still worth something: Spain. Muslim armies had crossed from Morocco into Spain back in the year 711, and the Visigothic kingdom, divided at the top exactly as we left it, collapsed with astonishing speed. Its last effective king, Roderick, was defeated in a single battle in the south, and within a decade almost the entire peninsula was under Muslim rule. The new territory was called Al-Andalus, but conquering a land is one thing, governing it is another. For 40 years, Al-Andalus was a violent frontier province, torn by feuds between Arab factions and Berber soldiers who felt cheated of land and pay, ruled by governors who came and went, sometimes through assassination. Into this chaos, in the year 755, stepped a 25-year-old political refugee with the most famous family name in the Islamic world. It was enough. Umayyad loyalists and disaffected soldiers rallied to him. In May of 756, his forces met the army of the sitting governor outside Córdoba, near the river. Accounts of the battle describe Abd al-Rahman riding a mule rather than a war horse, reportedly to show his men he did not intend to flee. He won. Entered Córdoba, and he made a decision that changed European history. He did not use Spain as a base to win back Damascus. He decided that Spain was the prize itself. He declared Al-Andalus an independent emirate, with Córdoba as its capital, answering to no one. The Abbasids did not accept this quietly. A few years later, the Abbasid Caliph backed an army against him. Abd al-Rahman destroyed it, and then, according to the chronicles, had the heads of its commanders preserved in salt and sent east as a message. The Caliph who received that package is said to have thanked God for putting the sea between himself and such an enemy. The story may be embellished. The strategic fact is not. The Abbasids never seriously attempted to take Spain again. The exile had become a founder. For the next 30 years, he built walls, administration, loyal garrisons, and the beginnings of the Great Mosque we will enter in the next chapter. He planted gardens outside Córdoba with trees imported from Syria, and a short poem attributed to him addresses a palm tree directly. You too are a stranger in the West. It says, far from your home. Whether he truly composed those lines or later writers gave them to him. Generations of Andalusi historians repeated the poem because it captured a truth everyone could feel. The most powerful man in Spain was a refugee who never stopped missing a home he could never see again. Pause on what this means, because it speaks directly to anyone watching in America or Europe today. The state that would build the most brilliant city in Western Europe was founded by a political refugee, a man whose family had been murdered, who crossed continents with almost nothing, and whose success was helped by the fact that he belonged to two worlds at once, Arab and Berber, Easterner and Westerner. Córdoba's golden age did not grow from purity. It grew out of displacement. That is not a moral slogan. It is simply what happened. Abd al-Rahman I died in 788, in his bed, in his palace, in his capital. Almost no one else in his family had died peacefully. He left his heirs a functioning state. And he left them one more thing, begun in the final years of his life, on the flat ground by the Roman bridge, on the site associated with the Church of San Vicente. He left them a construction project. Chapter 3. A mosque built from borrowed stones. Every empire announces itself with a building. Athens raised the Parthenon. Rome raised the Colosseum. The Umayyads of Spain raised a forest. Walk into the Mezquita of Córdoba today, and this is what happens to you. You pass through a courtyard of orange trees, through a door, and into shadow, and then the columns begin. Column after column after column, more than 850 of them now, marching away from you in every direction until they dissolve into the dark. Each pair connected by a double arch striped in red brick and white stone. Visitors in the 21st century describe the same sensation that travelers described 1,000 years ago. It does not feel like being inside a building. It feels like standing in an endless grove of stone trees. A single, elegant idea repeated until it becomes a world. Now look closer at the columns themselves, because they are the secret of this whole story, and they are the reason this chapter has its name. The columns do not match. Some are pink marble, some grey granite, some smooth, some fluted, some capitals are carved in the Roman style, some in the Visigothic style, some are older than the building by 500 years or more. Scholars who have studied them conclude that a great number were reused, salvaged from Roman-era ruins and older buildings across the region. Why the builders worked this way is partly practical and partly guesswork. Ready-made columns were available. They were faster and cheaper than quarrying new stone. Ancient materials carried a prestige of their own, and using them made a statement about who now inherited the past. Whatever mix of motives drove those decisions, the result is a fact you can see with your eyes. The first Muslim builders of Córdoba raised their sanctuary out of the Roman and Christian past, and that past is still standing inside it, holding up the roof. Whether they intended the symbolism or not, they built a portrait of the society outside the walls. Al-Andalus itself stood on borrowed columns, Roman roads and irrigation, Visigothic farmers and craftsmen, Jewish merchants and scholars, Arab rulers, Berber soldiers, and a native population that was, in the beginning, overwhelmingly Christian. Nothing matched. Everything held. The site tells a story too, though here we must be careful, because the sources are contested. The traditional account, preserved by later Muslim historians, says that after the conquest, Muslims and Christians shared the church complex of San Vicente for decades, praying in different sections of the same grounds, and that Abd al-Rahman I then purchased the Christian share for a large sum before demolishing the old complex to raise his mosque. Modern historians are divided. Some find the account broadly plausible, noting that similar stories are told about early mosques in Syria. Others suspect it was written later to give the mosque a cleaner legal pedigree. What archaeology confirms is simpler. Beneath the mosque floor lie remains of earlier Christian-era buildings, including mosaics you can view today through openings in the floor. The building sits physically on top of its predecessors. In Córdoba, that is not a metaphor. It is the ground plan. There is one more puzzle built into the stones. Mosques are oriented toward Mecca, which from Spain lies roughly to the east and southeast. The mezquita points south. Scholars have debated the reason for generations, and no single answer has won. Some argue the builders simply followed the street grid of the Roman city and the foundations already on the site. Others suggest they echoed the orientation used in Umayyad, Syria, so that a dynasty in exile could pray, facing the same way as the mosques of its lost homeland. Both are hypotheses, not settled fact. But notice what they have in common. Either the building bends to Rome, or it bends to Damascus. Either way, this most original of buildings is anchored in a memory of somewhere else, like its founder, like the palm tree in his garden. The mosque was not finished once. In a sense, it was never finished at all. And that is the other thing that makes it unusual. Each ruler enlarged it as the city grew, opening the far wall and extending the forest of columns southward and eastward. Generation after generation, for 2 centuries, the building grew the way a tree grows, in rings. Architectural historians can walk through it today and read the decades in the stonework. From the improvisation of the 780s to the mathematical confidence of the 10th century, few buildings on earth let you walk through 200 years of a civilization's self-esteem in 200 meters. The city around the mosque was growing just as fast. Through the 800s, under the emirs who followed Abd al-Rahman I, Córdoba swelled with markets, baths, and suburbs spreading along the river. It was not a peaceful century. There were tax revolts, palace intrigue, and violent uprisings in the city's own suburbs that were crushed without mercy. There was also friction inside the city's mixed society, including a famous and tragic episode in the 850s, when a group of Christians in Córdoba deliberately sought execution by publicly denouncing Islam, knowing the legal penalty, in protest against the steady Arabization of their own community. Around 50 were put to death and are remembered as the martyrs of Córdoba. Historians still debate how to read that episode. But at minimum, it tells us something important and honest. Coexistence in Córdoba was real, and it was also tense, negotiated, and sometimes deadly. It was never the postcard that some modern tellings make of it. Keep that in mind for Chapter 6, because this story will refuse to hand you a fairy tale in either direction. Yet, through all of it, the deeper current moved one way. Córdoba was becoming less of a frontier garrison and more of a genuine capital. Immigrants and ideas kept arriving from the east. A famous musician from Baghdad named Ziryab settled in Córdoba in the 800s and, according to accounts written generations later, transformed the city's manners, introducing new fashions, new music, new refinements of dining. Later, chroniclers credit him with so many innovations that historians suspect his legend absorbed the work of many people. But the legend itself is the evidence. Córdoba had become the kind of city that told stories about style, not just war. By the year 900, this Córdoba, wealthy, crowded, sophisticated, and quarrelsome, was still officially just an emirate, a province that had wandered off from an empire. Its ruler carried the modest title of emir, while in Baghdad the Abbasid Caliph claimed authority over all Muslims. And in North Africa, a new rival power was rising and claiming the same. In the year 912, a new ruler inherited Córdoba. He was 21 years old, red-haired, blue-eyed, the grandson of a Christian princess from the north. The chronicles say he dyed his beard black to look more Arab. He would rule for nearly half a century, and he would make a decision his ancestors never dared to make. He would look east at Baghdad, and south at the rising power in Africa, and declare that the true center of the Islamic world was neither of them. It was his city. It was Córdoba. Chapter 4. The man who declared himself Caliph. The ruler who inherited Córdoba in the year 912 had no right to expect success. His name was Abd al-Rahman, the third ruler of that name, and the state he inherited was falling apart. Rebellions burned across Al-Andalus. A charismatic rebel named Umar ibn Hafsun had carved out a mountain domain in the south and defied Córdoba for decades. Local lords ignored the capital. Tax revenue had collapsed. In the north, the small Christian kingdoms that had survived the conquest in the mountains were growing bolder. Raiding southward, serious historians have argued that in 912, the emirate effectively controlled little more than Córdoba itself and its surrounding countryside. The state built by the exile of Damascus was one bad decade from disappearing. And there was something more personal. The young emir had grown up inside a palace soaked in blood. His own father had been executed on the orders of his grandfather, the old emir, who then chose the dead man's son as his heir. Abd al-Rahman III was raised. In other words, by the man who had killed his father. Whatever that does to a person, it does not usually produce patience and balance. In his case, somehow, it did. He would need both. He spent the first 20 years of his reign doing the least glamorous work a ruler can do, reconquering his own country, year after year, campaign after campaign. He ground down the rebellions, took the mountain fortresses, and replaced defiant local dynasties with governors who answered to Córdoba. He was methodical rather than merciful, and we should not pretend otherwise. Rebels who surrendered on terms were often treated generously. Rebels who fought to the end were made into examples, and the chronicles record executions in Córdoba staged as public theatre. This is how unified states were built in the 10th century. In Spain and everywhere else, by the late 920s, Al-Andalus was whole again. And then, in January of the year 929, Abd al-Rahman III did the thing his ancestors had never dared. He issued a proclamation to be read in every mosque. From that day forward, he was no longer merely an emir, a prince governing a province. He took the title of Caliph, successor to the Prophet, commander of the faithful. The title claimed by Baghdad, the title of the leader of the entire Islamic world. To understand the audacity, see the map as he saw it. In Baghdad sat the Abbasid Caliph, heir of the dynasty that had slaughtered his family. Though by now the Abbasids were weakening, increasingly controlled by their own soldiers, and in North Africa, directly across the water, a new power had risen, the Fatimids, a revolutionary Shia dynasty, had declared a rival caliphate of their own and openly intended to expand across the Muslim world. The Fatimids were the immediate threat, ideological, aggressive, and close. Seen in that light, the proclamation of 929 was not vanity. It was strategy. Declaring a caliphate in Córdoba told every Muslim in Spain and North Africa that they did not need to look east for legitimacy, and it planted a flag directly against Fatimid propaganda. Historians broadly agree that the timing, just as Fatimid power was surging, was no coincidence. It was a message aimed south. A caliph cannot live like a governor. So, in 936, on the slopes west of Córdoba, Abd al-Rahman III began building an entire royal city from open ground. He named it Madinat al-Zahra, the shining city. The scale is hard to believe even now. Standing in its excavated ruins, terraces cut into the hillside so the city descended in steps toward the river plain, a palace complex above, government offices and gardens in the middle, mosque and markets below. The whole city, a diagram of power you could read from a distance. Later, Arab writers filled their accounts with details that sound like fairy tales. Thousands of columns, a reception hall with a basin of mercury that could be set moving to fill the room with sliding light, arches of ivory and ebony. These descriptions were written after the city's destruction, by authors mourning a lost wonder, and archaeologists caution that grief inflates architecture. But the ruins themselves, which you can walk through today a few kilometers outside Córdoba, confirm a project of staggering ambition. And they tell us the chroniclers were exaggerating something genuinely worth exaggerating. Madinat al-Zahra was government as performance. ambassadors from the German Emperor Otto I, from Constantinople, from Christian kings of the north, were received there and deliberately overwhelmed. One famous account describes a visiting envoy led through long ranks of soldiers and dignitaries in increasing splendor, expecting each grand figure to be the Caliph, until at last he was brought to a plain courtyard where a simply dressed man sat on the ground with a Koran, a sword, and a fire. That man was the Caliph. The theatre said, "Everything you passed is merely my servants. The story may be polished, but the diplomatic reality is documented." In the 10th century, embassies moved between Córdoba and the courts of Germany and Byzantium as between equals, and Christian rulers of the north at times paid tribute or sought Córdoba's arbitration in their own disputes. Step back and look at the sequence, because it is the reading this story will keep testing. Córdoba was not a cultural desert before 929. Puts, scholars, merchants and mixed neighborhoods had been at work for 2 centuries, but the particular flowering we associate with the caliphate, the palaces and the embassies and the great library of the next chapter, followed military reunification and centralization. The confidence came after the control and rested on it. Hold on to that ordering. When we reach the collapse, you will watch the same sequence run in reverse. One more detail, and it is the one to carry out of this chapter. A text attributed to the old Caliph, circulated after his death, claims he left behind a private note admitting that in 49 years of reign, absolute power, victory, and glory, he had counted the days of pure happiness he had enjoyed. The number written was 14. Historians cannot verify that he wrote it, and its earliest sources come generations later. But Al-Andalus itself chose to remember him this way, and that choice tells us what Córdoba, at its peak, believed about power. The man who owned the shining city, the story insists, was happy there for 2 weeks. What exactly had he built? This city that glittered more than it consoled. What was it actually like to live in Córdoba at the summit of its golden age? That is the next chapter, and it begins with 2 boys who never existed. Chapter 5. The City of Light. Imagine 2 boys, born in the same year, sometime around 950. Neither of them is a real person from the records. They are 2 invented lives, built from what historians know about typical conditions in 2 real places. The comparison is only worth anything if we play it straight. So we will. The first boy is born in London. His city is small, a trading town of a few thousand people on the Thames, recently refortified within its old Roman walls. His world is not ignorant, and it is not helpless. Anglo-Saxon England has monasteries that keep books, craftsmen in leather and metal, written law codes, and medical texts full of herbal remedies, some of which modern researchers have found surprisingly effective. But all of that knowledge lives in a thin layer. Books are rare and expensive, copied by hand onto animal skin. Unless this boy enters the church, he will probably never learn to read, and he may live his whole life without ever holding a book. His town has nothing resembling the paved and serviced street network of a great southern city. no public water system, no bathhouses. After sunset, his world is firelight and darkness. The second boy is born in Córdoba, and here is the honest version of what surrounds him. He grows up in a city that travelers and geographers of the age describe, with numbers modern historians still argue about: hundreds of mosques, public baths by the dozen or by the hundred, depending on the source. Estimates of the city's population range widely, from around 100,000 to several times that figure, depending on the year, the method, and how much of the sprawling suburbs you count. Even the cautious end of that range makes Córdoba one of the largest cities in Western Europe, far larger than London or Paris at the same date, in a class only a handful of cities on the continent could approach, with Constantinople far to the east in a league of its own. The difference between the two boys is not intelligence, and it is not virtue. It is infrastructure. The boy in Córdoba drinks from fountains fed by restored and extended water systems. He can bathe regularly in a public bathhouse for a small coin, because the bath, inherited from Rome and embraced by Islamic custom, is an ordinary part of urban life at every social level. This is a real difference between Al-Andalus and most of the Latin West, where bathing culture had faded along with the Roman towns, and where nothing on the scale of the bathhouse network existed. The difference was scale and habit, not some total ignorance of washing in the north. And it is striking enough, without exaggeration. At night, his city does not entirely go dark. Later descriptions of Umayyad Córdoba associate the central streets with paving, policing, and lamps burning after dark. How extensive that lighting really was, and how it was organized, remains uncertain, and historians warn against imagining anything like a modern municipal system. But even lamplight along the main streets and around the Great Mosque would have made the experience of a Córdoban night strikingly different from anything the boy in London could imagine. And organized street lighting does not arrive in the great northern capitals for centuries afterward. And then there are the books, because books are what made Córdoba legendary. The city was one of the great centers of book culture in Western Europe, and it is hard to name its equal west of Constantinople in this era. Papier, a technology arriving from the east, made books radically cheaper than parchment. The markets of Córdoba supported professional copyists, and the sources refer to women working in that trade, along with bookbinders and dealers trading manuscripts from Cairo and Baghdad. A scholar of the next century famously complained that wealthy men in Córdoba bought books they never read, simply to display them. That may be the most timeless sentence in this entire story. Any civilization rich enough to produce book collectors who do not read has reached a very specific stage of development, and every American with an unread bestseller on a nightstand is living in it now. Above this world of markets and copyists stood medicine and science, patronized at the highest level. In the Córdoba of this era worked a physician named al-Zahrawi, known to later Europeans as Abu Qasis, whose great medical encyclopedia, including its illustrated section on surgery and surgical instruments, was later translated into Latin and used as a reference in European medical schools for centuries. When surgeons in medieval Paris and Bologna trained, part of their training descended from a book written in the world of Córdoba. The countryside fed all of it, because this golden age had roots in dirt. Andalusi farmers, drawing on irrigation techniques and crops that spread along the trade routes of the Islamic world, expanded the cultivation of things that were rare, regional, or previously absent from much of Western Europe: oranges and lemons, rice and sugarcane, cotton and eggplants. Water wheels along the Guadalquivir lifted river water into channels, and the valley became one of the most productive landscapes on the continent. Some of those crops would eventually cross the Atlantic. A glass of orange juice in Florida stands at the end of a very long supply chain, and part of that chain runs through medieval Al-Andalus. Now, the necessary honesty, because this chapter refuses to become a postcard. This brilliant city ran on steep inequalities. It held enslaved people in large numbers, including many brought from the Slavic lands and their neighbors in Eastern and Central Europe. So many that Arabic writers used a single term, Sakhaliba, for people from that whole region, a word that preserves in its sound the memory of an enormous and brutal trade. Córdoba's splendor was funded partly by tribute and by raiding wars against the Christian north, and those wars filled its markets with captives. Women of the elite lived with sharply limited public freedom, though we know of educated women, poets and copyists, who found room inside those limits. The boy in Córdoba enjoys his lamplit streets inside a society that would strike a modern American as deeply unfree in other ways. Both facts are true. Hold both. Before we leave the street, walk to the southern edge of the city and stand on the old Roman bridge for a moment, because the bridge is the best place to understand what you have just seen. Below you, the river that started everything, now turning water wheels. Behind you, the forest of columns, 3 generations of expansions deep. Around you, porters, mule-trains, farmers crossing to market. The traffic of a capital passing over stones the Romans laid and the emirs repaired. Every civilization in this story maintains this bridge, because every civilization needs it. Infrastructure, unlike ideology, has no party, which brings us to the real question, the one the next chapter exists to answer. A city this size, this rich, this bookish, was not a Muslim city in any simple sense. Its streets were full of Christians and Jews. Its markets ran in Arabic and in the local Romance speech. Its bureaucracy needed every literate man it could find, whatever he believed. How did that actually work? Not in legend, in law, in money, in daily compromise, because the 10th century was about to produce something even rarer than a lamplit street. A Jewish physician was about to become one of the most powerful officials in the most powerful state in Western Europe. His story is next. Chapter 6. 3 Faiths. 1 Payroll. Sometime in the 940s or 50s, a letter left Córdoba and traveled east, carried through merchant networks across the width of the known world. It was written in Hebrew. Its author was one of the most influential men in the caliphate of Córdoba, and he was writing because he had heard a rumor almost too good to believe. A rumor about a kingdom on the steppes near the Caspian Sea whose kings, it was said, had converted to Judaism. The author's name was Hasdai ibn Shaprut. He was a Jew, a physician by training, and by the time the letter was written he had risen to become one of the Caliph's most trusted officials. In the letter, he introduces himself and his country with unmistakable pride, describing the wealth of Al-Andalus and his own position in it. Then the tone changes, and this powerful, successful man asks the question that reveals everything. He asks whether it is really true that somewhere on earth there is a place where Jews rule themselves, because, if it is true, he writes, he would give up his honors and his position and cross mountains and seas just to see it. We should say plainly what scholars say about this document. A version of the letter survives, along with a reply said to come from the Khazar king, and specialists have argued for generations about how much of the correspondence is authentic, later edited, or partly composed by other hands. What no serious scholar disputes is the world the letter describes. A Jewish courtier really did stand near the summit of power in Umayyad Córdoba, and the letter's longing tells us how that courtier, or those writing in his name, understood the arrangement. Even at the top, he counted himself a guest. Hold that thought, because the whole complicated truth of Córdoba is folded inside it. A Jew could rise to the summit of influence in this Muslim state. That is astonishing. And it was real. And that same man, at the summit, still dreamed of a country where his people did not depend on anyone's permission. Both halves are the story. Most tellings give you only one. So let us open the machinery. How did three religions actually share one city? The legal framework was called the Dhimma. Under Islamic law, Christians and Jews were recognized as people of the book, followers of earlier revelations, and as such they were protected. Protected is a precise word. They could live, worship, own property, run businesses, and govern their own communities under their own religious courts for internal matters. In exchange, they paid a special tax called the jizya, one obligation among the different burdens that different communities carried, and they accepted a set of restrictions. They could not seek converts among Muslims. A non-Muslim man could not marry a Muslim woman. New church construction was legally restricted. In principle, though enforcement varied enormously by time and place, there were rules meant to mark their subordinate status in public life. Notice what this was and what it was not. It was not equality. No state in the 10th century, on any continent, offered equality between religions. It was also not persecution as the medieval Latin West would come to practice it, with forced conversions and mass expulsions. It was a protected but subordinate legal status, a legally recognized place, rather than one resting only on temporary favor. And the price of that recognition was accepting the lower rung. How much protection it delivered in practice depended on the ruler, the school of law, the region, and the decade. Historians who study Al-Andalus argue intensely over how to weigh all this. And the argument itself is famous. So you should hear both sides. One tradition of scholarship, whose best-known modern voice was Maria Rosa Menechal in a book called The Ornament of the World, emphasizes the astonishing results. Jews writing Hebrew poetry modeled on Arabic verse. Christians so immersed in Arabic culture that a 9th century writer complained young Christian men could compose in elegant Arabic but could barely write proper Latin. Shared music, shared food, shared science, a culture of coexistence, convivencia in Spanish, that produced things none of the three communities could have produced alone. Other historians answer that convivencia has been romanticized into a modern fantasy, a projection of our own hopes onto a medieval hierarchy. They point to the legal inferiority, to outbreaks of violence, including, in a later century, a massacre of the Jewish community of Granada in the year 1066, and to the fact that the system's tolerance was always conditional on the confidence of the rulers. When that confidence cracked, the protections cracked with it. So who is right? Here is the reading this film proposes, and we will flag it as exactly that, a reading, one interpretation among several that serious people hold. Both sides are describing the same machine. The dimmer was a pragmatic bargain, not a value. It functioned impressively when the state was strong, rich and secure, because a strong state profits from every talented taxpayer it can get, whatever their religion. It decayed when rulers grew weak and frightened, because frightened societies tend to convert difference into threat. On this reading, coexistence in Córdoba was not a moral achievement that mysteriously failed. It was a political structure that worked under specific conditions, and stopped working when the conditions disappeared. If that sounds relevant to America and Europe today, no strain was required to make it so. That is simply what the 10th century looks like when you describe it accurately. Religion and politics were not separate forces here. And we should not pretend the bargain was secular. Religious law defined it, but its health rose and fell with the security of the power that enforced it. Now watch the machine at its best. Through Hasdai himself, he entered the palace as a physician, reportedly winning fame for his role in recovering a celebrated antidote formula from ancient medicine. But his real instrument was language. He worked in Hebrew, Arabic, Latin, and Romance. In a court that negotiated with Christian kings, the German Empire and Constantinople, when an embassy from the Byzantine emperor arrived bearing a precious Greek manuscript, the text of Dioscorides on medicinal plants, Hasdai joined the team that turned it into usable Arabic in Córdoba, working alongside a Greek monk sent from Constantinople. Picture that room, a Jewish courtier and a Christian monk, translating Greek science, in the palace of a Muslim caliph, for the benefit of anyone in the city who could read. That room is the Golden Age, not a slogan about tolerance. A working group with a payroll. Hasdai used his position for his own community too, corresponding with the Jewish academies of the East, patronizing Hebrew poets and grammarians in Córdoba, helping to make Al-Andalus a major center of the Jewish intellectual world. The centuries that followed are still called the Golden Age of Hebrew literature, and much of it grew in the space he helped clear. One more figure completes the picture. A Christian bishop named Recimundo served the Caliph as a diplomat, traveling to the German court, and his name is attached to a famous calendar of Córdoba blending astronomy, agriculture, and the feast days of Christian saints, produced in the Caliph's orbit, a bishop, compiling saints' days for a Muslim ruler's court. The system had room for that too. This was the city at noon, 3 faiths, 1 payroll, held together by strength, money and mutual usefulness. But noon does not last. The Caliph who had built this world died in 961. His heir was a man who loved books more than power. And 2 people were waiting behind that throne. A woman whose name almost no one knows, and a man whose name the Christian North would learn to say with dread, "The library and the fire are next." Chapter 7. The Librarian and the Book Burner. The new Caliph, Al-Hakam II, had spent most of his life waiting. His father ruled for 49 years, which meant the son inherited the throne in 961, already in his late 40s. Scholarly, deliberate, and possessed by one great passion: books. Among medieval rulers anywhere, it is hard to name another whose defining ambition was a library. The palace library of Córdoba existed before him, but Al-Hakam transformed it. His agents worked the book markets of Cairo, Baghdad and Damascus with standing orders. One story, preserved in later sources, says he paid a fortune in gold to the author of a famous anthology in the East simply to receive the first copy before anyone in Baghdad. Teams of copyists, editors and binders worked in the palace itself, and the catalogue of this library, according to accounts written in the following century, ran to dozens of volumes just to list the titles. The figure those later sources give for the collection is 400,000 books. Historians treat that number with real caution, as they treat all round numbers from medieval chronicles. It may count volumes rather than works, and it may have grown in the telling. Even so, the cautious version of the claim is extraordinary. This was one of the most celebrated book collections of its age, assembled in a century when a great monastery in France or Germany might treasure a few hundred volumes. Whatever the true number, the gap between Córdoba and the Latin North was not a gap. It was an abyss, and Al-Hakam read. Scholars who later handled his books reported his handwritten notes in the margins. Corrections, dates, comments on authors. This was not the trophy collecting we laughed about 2 chapters ago. By every surviving account, one of the most powerful men in Western Europe was a genuine scholar who happened to hold a throne. Under his patronage, schools multiplied and scholars drew salaries. And Córdoba's intellectual reputation reached its summit when a Saxon nun of this very era, the writer Hrotsvitha, described Córdoba from distant Germany. She called it the ornament of the world. The phrase people still use for this city was coined by a Christian woman who never saw it. He ruled for 15 years and made one mistake that undid all of it. He had his heir too late. When Al-Hakam died in 976, the throne passed to his son Hisham, a boy of about 11. A caliphate built around one man's authority now belonged to a child. Which brings us to the person the histories tend to reduce to a footnote. The boy's mother. Her name was Sub. The sources describe her as a captive from the Christian North who entered the palace as a concubine, became the favorite of the old Caliph, and bore him the sons who mattered. When her husband died and her 11-year-old son inherited a caliphate, Suv became the single most important political actor in Al-Andalus, because whoever controlled the boy controlled the state. She had access to the treasury. She had the ear of the palace. And she needed capable men who owed their careers entirely to her. She found one, a young official from a minor provincial family, a former law student working his way up through the palace bureaucracy. Energetic, brilliant, and completely dependent on her favor. His name was Muhammad ibn Abi Amir. Sub advanced him, entrusted him with the management of her son's affairs and estates, and lifted him past older and better connected rivals. Historians have argued for 1,000 years about the exact nature of their relationship, and the chronicles are full of gossip that cannot be verified. What the record supports is the political fact. The woman at the center of the palace made the career of the man who would take the palace. Because he did take it, history remembers him by the title he gave himself, Al-Mansur, the victorious. Christians of the north would learn to pronounce it with dread as Almanzor. Within a few years of the old caliph's death, the chief minister was dead. Rivals were exiled or eliminated, and the young Caliph Hisham was sealed away in his palace, wrapped in ceremony and stripped of every function of rule. Al-Mansur never called himself Caliph. He did not need the title. He built himself a new palace city east of Córdoba, mirroring Medinat al-Zahra, and ruled absolutely in the caliph's name, and Sub, the woman who had raised him up, discovered what she had built when she attempted, late in the game, to move funds and support toward recovering her son's independence. Al-Mansur crushed the effort. The accounts of the period describe her final years as a defeat. Sidelined in the palace she had once commanded. Her son a ceremonial prisoner. The kingmaker had been removed by the king she made. It is the oldest political story there is. And it happened here first to a woman whose name most histories of Córdoba mention once and then forget. Understand what had just happened. Structurally, because this is the crack that brings down the whole building in the next chapter. For 2 centuries, the legitimacy of Al-Andalus ran through one family, the dynasty of the exile who swam the Euphrates. Al-Mansur proved that the machinery of the state could be captured whole by anyone strong and clever enough, that the Caliph could be reduced to a sacred puppet. The precedent, once set, could not be unset. Rome learned the same lesson when its emperors became creatures of the army. A throne that can be captured once will be captured again. To be fair to the record, Al-Mansur did not rule by fear alone. His government collected taxes, administered justice, patronized poets, and kept the machinery of the caliphate running with real competence. But a usurper needs legitimacy, and Al-Mansur manufactured his from 2 materials above all: victory and piety. The victory was real. He reorganized the army, recruiting heavily from Berber North Africa, soldiers loyal to him personally rather than to Al-Andalus. Keep those Berber regiments in view, because they are loaded ammunition in the next chapter. He then launched campaigns against the Christian North at a tempo no ruler had attempted before, dozens across his career, striking Barcelona, Leon, Pamplona. In the year 997, he did the unthinkable, marching across the peninsula to sack Santiago de Compostela, the holiest shrine in Christian Spain. the reputed resting place of the Apostle James, and one detail of that raid became immortal. Christian tradition recorded that the great bells of the shrine were taken down and carried south, on the shoulders of Christian captives, hundreds of kilometers to Córdoba, where they were hung in the Great Mosque as lamps. Whether every link of that story happened exactly as told, the image of the bells in the mosque became one of the most repeated in medieval Spanish memory. On both sides of the frontier, those bells are not finished with this story. When they move again, an entire civilization will have turned upside down. The piety was performance, and one performance in particular concerns us. Early in his rise, needing the support of Córdoba's conservative religious scholars, who had always distrusted the palace's taste for Greek philosophy and astronomy, Almanzor gave them a gift. He opened Al-Hakam's library and allowed the objectionable sections to be purged. According to the account preserved by later Andalusi historians, books of philosophy, astrology, and the speculative sciences were pulled from the shelves and burned, or buried, or thrown into wells. The librarian's treasure fed the book burners' alliance. We do not know how many books were destroyed, and the library as a whole survived for now. But the message could not have been clearer. The knowledge of Córdoba existed at the pleasure of power, and power had just discovered that burning a book can buy more loyalty than reading one. Al-Hakam had spent 15 years demonstrating that a state could be built around learning. Almanzor spent 25 demonstrating how far a state could run on conquest. Plunder and fear, two models of what a ruler is for, tested in the same generation, in the same city, and the second one won the argument for as long as the man behind it lived. The next chapter is the invoice. Almanzor died in the year 1002, old and undefeated. Returning from his final campaign, a Christian chronicle marked his death with a sentence of magnificent hatred, recording that he was buried in hell. His system survived him by 6 years. What happened next destroyed the shining city, scattered the library, and ended the caliphate itself. Within a single generation, it was not done to Córdoba by a foreign conqueror. The hands that tore the city apart were, overwhelmingly, hands the city itself had armed. That civil war is the next chapter. Chapter 8. The Fitna. How a Golden Age Eats Itself. There is a word in Arabic for what happened to Córdoba between the years 1009 and 1031. The word is fitna. It is usually translated as civil war, but its older meanings cut deeper. Trial, temptation, the testing of a thing until it breaks. Arab historians reached for that word because no ordinary term for war could describe what they had witnessed. A civilization at the summit of the Western world tearing itself apart in a single generation. Here is the timeline that should be impossible. In the year 1000, Córdoba was among the largest and richest cities in Western Europe, seat of a caliphate that Christian kings had paid tribute to. By 1031, that caliphate had been formally abolished by an assembly of its own leading citizens. The shining city of Madinat al-Zahra was a looted ruin. Al-Andalus had shattered into dozens of quarreling successor states. No crusade did this. No invading empire planned it. The catastrophe began inside the walls. In the cracks, we have already watched form. Though once the walls cracked, every armed power within reach came pouring through them. Count those cracks again, because this chapter is where every earlier chapter sends its bill. Crack 1 came from Almanzor. He proved the Caliph could be reduced to a puppet, that the state was a machine anyone strong enough could seize. Crack 2 was his army. To free himself from the old Andalusi military families, he had imported regiments of Berber soldiers from North Africa, loyal to him personally, paid in cash and plunder, with shallow roots in the cities they garrisoned. Crack 3 was resentment. The people of Córdoba, taxed to fund endless wars and a parallel palace city, had spent a generation watching power flow to a usurper's household and his foreign troops. Almanzor's talented son held the system together for 6 years. Then, in 1008, that son died young, and his brother took over. The brother, known to history by a mocking nickname, Sanchuelo, Little Sancho, after his Christian grandfather, made the mistake that lit the fuse. He pressured the powerless Caliph Hisham to name him, Sanchuelo, as heir to the caliphate itself. The puppet was asked to hand over not just the power, but the title, the sacred legitimacy that had anchored Al-Andalus since the exile swam the Euphrates. Córdoba exploded. While Sanchuelo was away on campaign, the city rose behind an Umayyad prince, seized the palaces, and looted the regime's treasures. Sanchuelo's army melted away on the road home, and he was captured and killed. At that moment, with the usurper dynasty gone, Córdoba might have restored the old caliphate and moved on. Instead, the new ruler made the fatal choice. To secure his coup, he turned popular resentment loose against Almanzor's Berber soldiers, and street anger became open season. Berber troops were attacked in Córdoba. Their response set the peninsula on fire. The Berber regiments regrouped, chose a rival Umayyad prince as their own candidate, and made war on the capital. What followed was not one civil war, but a cascade of them. Coups inside coups. In roughly 20 years, the throne of Córdoba changed hands around a dozen times, cycling through Umayyad claimants and, astonishingly, through members of a Berber family, the Hammadids, who claimed the caliphal title themselves. Each new ruler bought soldiers with a shrinking treasury and taxed a shrinking city. Both sides hired Christian soldiers from the north, and the northern kings, who a generation earlier had bowed to Córdoba, now sold their swords to both camps and collected fortresses as payment. The tribute machine had reversed direction. 2 deaths from the catastrophe deserve to be seen closely, because they are the 2 that mattered most. The first is the death of the shining city. In 1010, in the fighting between Berber forces and the Cordoban regime, Madinat al-Zahra was captured, plundered, and burned. The palace city that had taken decades to build, the reception halls that had humbled ambassadors from Constantinople, was wrecked within about 75 years of its foundation. It was never rebuilt. What the war began, time finished. As later generations quarried the ruins for building stone, until the shining city sank beneath its own hillside. It stayed buried for 9 centuries. Walk its excavated streets today, and you are walking through the most expensive lesson in this entire story. A civilization needs decades to build its pride, and only a few seasons of madness to lose it. The second death is quieter. In the chaos, the great library of Al-Hakam II was scattered. Sources from the period record that books were sold to raise money for the war. Dispersed, plundered, lost. One detail preserved in later accounts is painfully practical. Scholars fleeing Córdoba carried books with them, and collections gathered over a lifetime from Cairo and Baghdad left the city in saddlebags. Scattering across the towns of Spain, hold that image of the saddlebags. It looks like pure destruction. It is also, secretly, a seed. The war came for the people too. In 1013, after a long siege, Berber forces retook Córdoba and subjected it to a sack that contemporary writers describe with horror. The upheaval of these years drove families out of the city in every direction. Among them, according to the traditions about his early life, a young Jewish scholar named Samuel ibn Nagrila, who made his way south. His second act, rising to become vizier and battlefield commander of the Muslim kingdom of Granada, showed that the world of 3 faiths survived the fall of the capital. But notice where it survived. Not in Córdoba. In the fragments, and here, in the middle of the wreckage, stands the one person from these years that everyone remembers, which tells you something about what actually survives a collapse. Her name was Walada bint al-Mustakfi. She was the daughter of one of the last caliphs of Córdoba, a man who held the title for a matter of months during the chaos before he was driven out and died. Her father's fall left her with a great name, an inheritance, and no protector, and what she did with that combination made her famous for 1,000 years. She did not remarry into safety. She opened her house in Córdoba as a literary salon, where poets, musicians and students gathered to compete and argue and recite. She wrote poetry of her own, sharp, proud, sometimes savagely funny, including verses aimed at the great poet Ibn Zaydun, who loved her and quarreled with her and was exiled from the city. Later, tradition says she embroidered her own verses on her robes, and that detail may be legend, but it survived because it fit the woman the sources describe. Read what she represents in the middle of this chapter. The state had failed. The palaces were burning. The Caliph her father briefly was had become a fugitive, and a woman of that ruined dynasty responded by making a room in Córdoba where the culture kept working. On private money, under no protection at all. Ibn Zaydun, writing from exile, produced one of the most famous poems in Arabic literature, a lament that mourns his lost love and his lost city together, remembering the gardens of Madinat al-Zahra that were already ruins, as he wrote. The greatest poetry of Córdoba was written after Córdoba fell, by people who had lost everything the previous chapters described. That is the pattern of this entire story. Arriving early. By 1031, everyone had had enough. The leading men of Córdoba convened and did something almost without precedent in the medieval world. They formally abolished the caliphate. declared the office vacant and set up a council of notables to run what was left of the city. The state founded by Abd al-Rahman I proclaimed a caliphate by Abd al-Rahman III, was voted out of existence by a committee. Al-Andalus dissolved into the Taifa kingdoms, from an Arabic word meaning faction: Seville, Granada, Toledo, Saragossa, dozens of successor states, each with a king, a court, and an army too small to defend it, set this collapse beside the golden age it destroyed. And one reading of the whole story comes into focus. In Chapter 4, we watched a sequence: first control, then wealth, then confidence. The Fitna ran that sequence in reverse. First, the legitimacy cracked. Then the army split along factional lines. Then the money burned. And the openness died last. Not by decree, but by fear, as communities in the chaos pulled inward and armed themselves. That is an interpretation, not a law of history, and other historians would weigh the scales differently, adding dynastic ambition, religious factions, and the pull of outside powers, but the core of it holds. Coexistence was the top floor of the building. It fell because the foundations did. And yet, stand in the wrecked Córdoba of 1031, and you would swear the story of Andalusi brilliance was over. You would be wrong in the strangest way. The Taifa courts, competing for prestige, began collecting the scattered scholars and the scattered books, and the fragments of the exploded caliphate started to glow individually, like embers kicked from a fire. The saddlebags were about to teach a continent. But first, out of Africa, the Puritans were coming. Chapter 9. The refugees who taught Europe. The Taifa kings had money, taste, and fear, and that combination wrote the next act. Too weak to fight the Christian North, they paid tribute to it, and the tribute flowed north in gold while confidence drained south. In 1085, the unthinkable happened. Toledo, the old Visigothic capital, one of the great cities of Al-Andalus, passed to King Alfonso VI of Castile, not in a storm of blood, but by negotiated surrender, a ripe fruit dropping into a waiting hand. Panic swept the Taifa courts, and the King of Seville made a decision he reportedly justified with one of the most quoted sentences in Spanish history. Asked why he would invite the fierce Berber Empire of the Almoravids from Morocco to save Muslim Spain, knowing they might swallow it, he answered, according to the chronicles, that he would rather herd camels in Africa than herd pigs in Castile, meaning, better a Muslim master than a Christian one. The Almoravids came, crushed Alfonso's army in 1086, looked around at the wine drinking, poetry writing, tribute paying Taifa kings, and within a decade deposed them and annexed Al-Andalus themselves. The camel herder's bargain came due in full. The Almoravids were desert reformers, hardened by a strict and simple reading of the faith. 2 generations later, they were succeeded by an even more radical Berber movement, the Almohaj, who crossed from Morocco in the mid-1100s, preaching a revolutionary purification of Islam under Almohad rule. The old Andalusi bargain was broken. The sources record forced conversions of Jews and Christians, the closing and destruction of churches and synagogues, and communities driven into exile or underground. The Dhimma, that protected but subordinate status we examined in Chapter 6, was suspended by the very power that was supposed to enforce it. The warning written into the system from the beginning had come true. The protections were conditional, and the conditions were gone. And here history produces one of its cruelest ironies. The two most famous minds Córdoba ever gave the world were born in this city within a few years of each other, and both had their lives bent by this same hard age. One stayed and served it. One fled it as a child. Both paid. Both won. The first was born in Córdoba in 1126, into a dynasty of judges. His name was Ibn Rushd. Europe would mangle it into Averroes. He was the complete Andalusi intellectual, a chief judge, a court physician, and above all, a philosopher. The Almohad Caliph himself, whose private curiosity ran wider than his movement's slogans, gave him a career-defining commission. Aristotle, the Caliph complained, was too difficult to understand. Explain him. Averroes spent decades doing exactly that, writing commentary after commentary on most of Aristotle's known works. Short versions, middle versions, vast line-by-line analyses. He argued, in works that still read as bracingly confident, that philosophy and faith cannot truly contradict each other, and that the law itself obliges those capable of reasoning to reason. Then the weather changed. In 1195, facing crusading pressure from the north and needing the loyalty of the religious scholars, the Almohad regime turned on its philosopher. Averroes was denounced and banished in disgrace to a small town outside Córdoba, and some accounts report that his philosophical works were ordered, burned, or banned. An old man, watching the dynasty he had served condemn his life's work, he was partially rehabilitated shortly before his death in Marrakesh in 1198. If this story sounds familiar, it should. It is Seneca again. 11 centuries later, Córdoba's greatest mind, punished by the power he served. This city keeps writing the same tragedy with different names. But the fire missed. Within a few decades of his death, Averroes's commentaries, translated into Latin and Hebrew, largely through the translation movement flourishing in Toledo and in Italy and Sicily, reached the young universities of Paris, Oxford, and Bologna. Latin Europe at that moment knew only part of Aristotle, mainly his logic. Now the rest of him arrived, with a brilliant Muslim guide attached. An author so dominant that Christian scholars called him not by name, but simply the commentator. He became unavoidable. The ferment he ignited was serious enough that church authorities in Paris in the 1270s formally condemned a list of propositions associated with his more radical Latin readers, which tells you exactly how seriously Europe was taking a judge from Córdoba. Thomas Aquinas, the greatest Christian thinker of the Middle Ages, built his own system in constant argument with Averroes, page after page. Dante, writing his tour of the afterlife, placed Averroes among the honored sages of antiquity. The philosopher condemned in Al-Andalus became required study in the civilization next door. The second mind was younger, and his story is harsher. Moses ben Maimon, known to the world as Maimonides, was born in Córdoba into a rabbinic family. In 1138, by the traditional date, though many scholars now argue for 1135, he was heir to the Jewish golden age that Hasdai ibn Shaprut had seeded 2 centuries earlier. When the Almohads took Córdoba around 1148, his family faced the choice presented to the Jewish community: conversion, death, or flight. He was a boy of 10 or 13. Depending on which birth year you accept, the family fled, and for years they moved through Spain and North Africa, living, according to the accounts of the period, in concealment and fear. Scholars still debate whether they were forced into an outward show of conversion during those years. Eventually they escaped east, and Maimonides settled in Egypt, in Old Cairo, so Córdoba shaped him for only a childhood, and everything he built elsewhere. That is precisely the point. In Cairo, he led the Jewish community, practiced medicine, and served as a physician within the court circle of Saladin's family, the dynasty of the Sultan who took Jerusalem in 1187, and he wrote the works that made him immortal, a monumental codification of Jewish law, a book called The Guide for the Perplexed, written in Arabic, wrestling faith and Aristotle into the same room, working the same Greek and Arabic tradition as Averroes. Jewish tradition summarizes his stature in a proverb still repeated today: from Moses to Moses. There was none like Moses. Few figures in the history of Judaism are placed on that level, and throughout his life he signed himself the Sephardi, the Spaniard, the man from Al-Andalus. He never saw Córdoba again after boyhood, and he never stopped naming himself after the world it had given him. 2 boys from the same city, under the same falling regime. One became the commentator of Christian Europe. The other became one of the greatest Jewish thinkers since antiquity. Working under a Muslim sultan, here is the sentence to keep from this chapter. Córdoba's greatest gift to the world was delivered by its refugees. The Golden Age did not simply end when the city broke. It moved into saddlebags, onto exile roads, into translation rooms in Toledo and court clinics in Cairo. And it kept teaching for centuries after the classrooms that produced it were gone. Displacement founded this city's greatness in Chapter 2, and displacement carried its inheritance out at the end. Back in Spain, the Almohad Empire that had burned the books and broken the communities marched north in 1212 to settle accounts with the Christian kings, and suffered a shattering defeat at Las Navas de Tolosa. At the hands of a coalition it had helped to unite, the empire staggered on for decades, but its power in Spain never recovered, and the cities of Al-Andalus began to fall like beads off a cut string. And in Castile there was a young king, patient, pious and relentless, who had his eyes on the greatest bead of all, the old capital, the city of the bells, because in Córdoba's Great Mosque, by long tradition, the bells of Santiago still hung as lamps, right where Almanzor's raid had left them 2 centuries earlier, and Fernando III of Castile intended to send them home. Chapter 10, 1236. The Bells Return. In the winter of 1235, A handful of Christian soldiers climbed the walls of Córdoba in the dark. They were not an army. They were raiders, frontier men from the borderlands. And according to the accounts of the period, they had learned from informers that a section of the eastern suburb was carelessly guarded. They scaled the wall at night, seized a few towers, and opened a gate. It was an opportunistic strike at the edge of a great city. The kind of raid that had happened 100 times on this frontier and usually ended with the raiders trapped and killed. Then they sent word north, to the King of Castile, and the king dropped everything. Fernando III was far to the north when the message reached him. In the middle of winter, with rivers flooded and roads drowned, any reasonable adviser would have said what advisers always say: wait for spring. Fernando rode south with a small escort at punishing speed, gathering forces as he went, because he understood exactly what those raiders were holding. Not a suburb, a door. The door to the old capital of Al-Andalus. The city every chronicler on both sides of the frontier treated as a legend. The siege that followed lasted months. As the king's army grew and the city, cut off from relief, starved, the fractured Muslim powers of the south could not save it in time. On the 29th of June, 1236, Córdoba surrendered on terms. The inhabitants who wished to leave were allowed to depart with what they could carry. Picture the road out. It ran south, over the bridge, the same crossing the Romans built and the emirs repaired, the one this story has kept in view since chapter 1. Now carrying a column of families walking away from a city their ancestors had lived in for 500 years, past water wheels their great-grandfathers built, out toward Granada and the sea and North Africa. The bridge does not care who is walking. That is exactly what makes it the most honest witness in this entire history. It carried the oil ship's traffic and the Caliph's ambassadors and the refugees of a conquest. On the same stones, in the same century, and it will carry tourists in 2026. Fernando entered the city that had ruled Spain for 5 centuries. And there was one place he went to make the conquest mean something. He went to the Great Mosque. You already know what tradition says was hanging inside. The bells of Santiago de Compostela, carried south in 997, hung in the mosque as lamps for 239 years. The Christian chronicles of the conquest tell what Fernando did next, and they tell it with relish, because everyone understood the symbolism instantly. He took the bells down and sent them home to Santiago, and the chroniclers made sure to record the detail that completed the reversal, that the bells traveled north on the shoulders of Muslim captives, just as they had once traveled south on the shoulders of Christian ones. Whether every link of that story is documented fact or polished memory, medieval Spain told it constantly, on both sides, because it said what everyone felt. The world had turned upside down, and the image cuts in both directions, which is exactly why this story was built around it. Whoever rings the bell, someone else is carrying it. That is the honest summary of 5 centuries of frontier war. In one sentence, days after the surrender, the Great Mosque was formally consecrated as a cathedral, and now something happened that few people expect. Almost nothing. There was no grand demolition. The Christians of Castile walked into the Forest of Columns, the most famous Muslim building in Western Europe, and they kept it. They installed altars and chapels among the arcades, made the changes a working cathedral needed, and otherwise let the building stand. For nearly 3 centuries they worshipped inside an essentially Islamic architectural masterpiece, maintaining it, admiring it, burying their nobles in it. Whatever the men of the 13th century believed about the faith of their enemies, they could see what they were standing in, hold on to that restraint. In the next chapter, it runs out. The Córdoba that Fernando took, we should say honestly, was no longer the city of light. The Fitna, the sackings and the long starvation of the frontier had reduced it to a shadow, and the conquest reduced it further. Most of the Muslim population departed or was displaced, and the Christian settlers who came from the north never filled the vast circuit of walls. Travelers in the following centuries describe entire quarters standing empty, churches rising in some neighborhoods while others quietly returned to orchards and dust. The capital of the Western world had become a provincial town wearing a crown several sizes too large. And yet the three-faith world of Al-Andalus did not vanish with the conquest. It changed masters and continued, in a form historians call Mudéjar Spain. Muslims now lived under Christian rule, with their own quarters, taxes and restrictions, a mirror image of the old Dimmer with the hierarchy inverted. Jewish communities, battered under the Almohads, initially found the new Christian kingdoms workable, serving Castilian kings as physicians, financiers and translators. The very roles Hasdai had played for a caliph, Fernando's own son. Alfonso X, called the Wise, ran translation projects where Jewish and Christian scholars worked side by side, turning Arabic science into Castilian and Latin. And when Fernando was buried in Seville, his tomb was inscribed in 4 languages: Castilian, Latin, Arabic, and Hebrew. A conqueror's monument, speaking to every community of his kingdom in its own tongue. For a while, it looked as if the machine of Chapter 6 had simply been bought by new owners and restarted. But you know the rule of that machine by now. The protections hold while the powerful feel secure, and fail when the powerful feel afraid. In the 1300s, plague, civil war, and economic misery broke over Castile, and preachers arose who explained the suffering by pointing at the Jews. Come down to the street one last time, because this is where the ending begins. What follows is an invented scene, not a family preserved in any record, built to show what the sources describe happening in cities across Spain that summer. It is a night in 1391. In the Jewish quarter of Córdoba, a tangle of lanes, a few minutes' walk from the cathedral that was a mosque. Imagine a house there, and a family inside it who have spent weeks listening to terrifying news arriving from Seville, where mobs have burned the Jewish quarter. Tonight, the noise is in their own streets. A father listens at the door. Somewhere out there, neighbors they have traded with for years are becoming a crowd. By morning, the quarter will be sacked. That much is not invented. The sources record killings across Córdoba and mass conversions under terror, part of a wave of violence that swept the cities of Spain in the summer of 1391. The Jewish community of Córdoba never recovered the world it had built. In its place appeared a new and unstable category of people, conversos, converts and their descendants, suspected by old Christians of secretly keeping their former faith, resented for their success, trapped between identities. A century later, the trap closed. In 1478, the Spanish Inquisition was founded largely to police those converts. In 1492, Granada, the last Muslim kingdom in Spain, surrendered to Fernando and Isabel. The Catholic monarchs, weeks later, the monarchs signed the edict expelling all Jews from Spain who would not convert. Within a generation, Islam was outlawed too, and in the early 1600s, even the descendants of converted Muslims were expelled from the peninsula. 8 centuries of Al-Andalus, and the older Roman habit beneath it, a society of mixed peoples on the same streets, were legislated out of existence in the name of an ideal that the monarchy pursued with increasing force. One authorized faith, under one crown. Weigh what this chapter has shown you. Coexistence in Spain was not killed on the battlefield in 1236. It survived the conquest for another century and a half under new management. What killed it came later, and came from many directions at once. Plague and fear, preachers and mobs, a new militant monarchy building unity out of uniformity. One way to summarize it is this: convivencia does not usually die in battle. It dies in bad decades, when frightened societies go looking for someone to blame. The Spain that emerged from 1492 was united, crusading, and suddenly, stunningly rich. Because that same year, a Genoese sailor funded by the same monarchs touched land across the Atlantic. A world empire was being born. And in Córdoba, a committee of clergymen was about to look at the forest of columns, the building even conquerors had spared, and decide it was not good enough. Chapter 11. You have destroyed something unique. We do not know the name of any workman who swung the first tool, and we know nothing of what he thought about it. But someone did. So imagine him, a stonemason of Córdoba, sometime in 1523, standing in the forest of columns with a demolition order in his ears, in a building his guild has maintained, prayed in, and buried its dead around for generations. He is invented. His situation is not. The order came from the Cathedral chapter. The clergy who governed the building, they had decided that worshipping among the low-striped arches was no longer adequate. They wanted what every other great Spanish city had: a soaring nave, achuar, a high altar, flooded with light, and they wanted it in the dead center of the forest. Our imagined mason would have known exactly what the city thought about that, because the city said it out loud. The Council of Córdoba, Christian men, descendants of the conquest, fought its own church to stop the project, and at the height of the fight it issued a decree threatening death to any workman who touched the old fabric. Sit with that for a moment. Christian magistrates, threatening execution to protect a mosque from a cathedral. It was not interfaith sentiment. It was something in some ways more interesting: civic identity. The people of Córdoba, whatever their faith, knew their building was unlike anything else they had ever heard of, and that the city's character lived inside it. The clergy went over the council's head, to the highest authority on earth, the young Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, King of Spain, ruler of lands from Vienna to Mexico. Charles had never seen Córdoba. He sided with the clergy. Permission granted, and so the crews went in, and out of the center of the forest they cut a hole the size of a church. Over the following decades, a full Renaissance cathedral rose inside the mosque. A bright, vertical explosion of vaults and choir stalls erupting through the striped horizon of the arches. A significant part of the old prayer hall was demolished or absorbed to make room. The building you visit today, and the astonishing collision at its heart, dates from that decision. Then comes the sentence. Tradition says that when Charles V finally visited Córdoba years later and stood in the construction he had authorized, he turned on the clergy and said words to this effect: "You have built what could have been built anywhere, and you have destroyed what was unique in the world." It is one of the most quoted lines in the history of architecture, and we have to be straight about it. No document from Charles's lifetime records it. The story surfaces in later tellings, and historians treat it as legend, or at best polished hearsay. It is worth repeating anyway, because the legend itself is evidence of something real. Spaniards began telling a story about their own monument, whose moral is regret. When a civilization invents a quotation, it is confessing something. And notice what the cathedral inside the mosque actually is, because it completes a pattern this story has been tracing since chapter 3. The mosque was raised on and out of the Roman and Christian past, on ground associated with San Vicente, absorbing older material into itself. The cathedral was then planted inside the mosque, absorbing it in turn. Neither transformation preserved everything. The mosque's builders demolished what stood before them. The cathedral's builders demolished part of what stood before them. Each faith, in its moment of power, destroyed, kept, and reinterpreted all at once. What makes Córdoba exceptionally rare is not that nothing was erased, it is that so much survived each erasure, so that today the layers stand locked together in one room, arguing with each other in stone. There are very few places anywhere that let you stand inside 8 centuries of that argument and hear every voice at once. While the cathedral rose, the city around it sank. The centuries after 1492 belonged to other places. Seville, downriver, won the legal monopoly on trade with the Americas and swelled into one of the largest cities in Europe as the silver of Mexico and Peru poured across its docks. Madrid, a modest town in the center of the peninsula, was made the royal capital in 1561 and grew into the empire's brain. Córdoba got neither the silver nor the court. It lived on leather work, silver craft and horses. Trades it was famous for, and on the church, whose institutions came to own a vast share of the city. Travelers in the 16 and 1700s describe a quiet, pious, shrinking town, sleeping inside a circuit of walls built for a metropolis. One image captures those centuries perfectly, and it stands where this story began. In the 1500s, the Crown studied plans to make the Guadalquivir navigable again for real traffic up to Córdoba, restoring the river highway that had carried Roman oil and caliphal wealth. Surveys were made. nothing lasting came of them. The river that had made the city was left to silt, and the old bridge crossed water that no longer led anywhere in particular. A city that had once been the destination of the Western world had become a place you passed through on the way to somewhere else. By the 1700s, when educated Europeans on their grand tours wrote their travel books, they described Córdoba in a tone we have not heard before in this story. Not envy, not fear, melancholy. A beautiful ruin wrapped around a miracle, inhabited by people who seemed, to visiting eyes, unaware of what they were living inside. The visitors were wrong about the unawareness, but they were the advance scouts of something enormous. Europe and America were about to fall in love with Al-Andalus, and the sleeping city was about to become a mirror in which the modern world examined itself. That awakening is next. Chapter 12. Rediscovery. In the spring of 1829, an American writer rode into Andalusia with a head full of stories. His name was Washington Irving, the New York author already famous for Rip Van Winkle and the Legend of Sleepy Hollow. And he was traveling through a country still recovering from catastrophe. Napoleon's armies had invaded Spain in 1808, and in June of that year French troops had stormed and sacked Córdoba, looting churches and homes in an episode the city remembered with bitterness for generations. The war that followed devastated the peninsula. But it had one strange side effect. It dragged thousands of literate foreigners, officers, artists, journalists, deep into a country much of Europe had stopped thinking about. Some of them walked into the forest of columns and came out changed. Irving arrived at the crest of that change. He lived for a time inside the Alhambra Palace in Granada and published Tales of the Alhambra in 1832. And the book became an international sensation. It gave the English-speaking world a story arc it has never let go of. The vanished golden kingdom of Moorish Spain. When American tourists stand in the Mezquita today, many of them are following an itinerary an American writer helped invent 200 years ago. We should be honest about this rediscovery, because it was double-edged. Al-Andalus had never been forgotten in Spain itself. Its buildings were in daily use. Its words were inside the Spanish language. Local scholars and clergy had studied and argued over its remains for centuries. What the Romantic writers and painters did was different. They put Al-Andalus back at the center of the European and American imagination, and they wrapped it in fantasy while they did it. Sighing fountains, noble Moors from central casting, harem scenes for the northern imagination. Scholars have spent the last century peeling the fantasy off the facts, and this account has tried to give you the facts underneath. But the fantasy did concrete good. It made the monuments matter to people with money and influence. Through the 1800s, restoration campaigns began at the Mezquita with a new archaeological and historical seriousness. In 1911, archaeologists began systematically excavating the buried ruins of Madinat al-Zahra, and the shining city that had slept under its hillside since the Fitna started coming back into the light, trench by trench, a process still unfinished today. The 20th century tested Spain with civil war and 4 decades of dictatorship, and Córdoba lived through it as a poor provincial capital, exporting its young people to the factories of Madrid. Barcelona, and Northern Europe, but recognition kept arriving. In 1984, UNESCO declared the Mezquita a World Heritage Site, extending the protection a decade later to the historic center around it. In 2018, Madinat al-Zahra received the same status. The official citations describe a unique testimony to a vanished civilization, which is a bureaucrat's way of saying what the legend of Charles V said. And the city itself, in recent decades, has deliberately reclaimed its plural past. A statue of Averroes stands near the old walls. A statue of Maimonides sits in the old Jewish quarter, its bronze shoe polished bright by the hands of visitors, and the small synagogue nearby, built in the 1300s and one of only 3 medieval synagogues surviving in all of Spain, has been restored as a monument. The refugees of Chapter 9 came home as statues. It took 700 years. Tourism became the city's lifeblood. In 2024, according to the monument's own published figures, more than 2 million people visited the mosque cathedral, and Córdoba now lives by those visitors, by its festivals, and by the flowered courtyards its residents open to the public each May. Then, on the night of the 8th of August, 2025, the layers nearly lost a piece. A fire broke out inside the mosque cathedral, reported to have started in an area used for storage, and flames and smoke damaged chapels in the eastern part of the building. In the section added during Almanzor's expansion, firefighters brought it under control the same night. The oldest and most famous elements, including the mihrab, escaped serious harm, and officials described the damage as contained and repairable, but for a few hours, nobody knew that. Residents came out into the streets around the monument in the dark, the way people do, and stood watching smoke rise over a roofline their city has looked at for 1,200 years. The images went around the world before dawn, and the reaction told you what this building has become. A city held its breath, and so did people on every continent, of every faith and of none, including a great many who have never been to Spain and never will. 12 centuries after the first borrowed columns went up, the world discovered how much it minds the thought of losing them. The fright arrived in the middle of an argument, because the building's identity is still contested. Politely, in the present tense, 2 disputes surround it today, and an honest account reports both without pretending to referee. The first is about the name. For years, official materials often called the building simply the Cathedral, and critics, including local civic groups and historians, objected that dropping the word mosque erased part of its history. The common designation now is the Mosque Cathedral of Córdoba, and arguments over its management, its ownership status, and the emphasis of its presentation continue in Spanish newspapers, courts, and city politics. The second dispute is about prayer. The building functions as a consecrated Catholic cathedral, and the Church does not permit Muslim worship inside it. Muslim organizations have at times requested some form of shared or occasional access, and there have been incidents over the years when visitors attempted to pray and were stopped. The Spanish state has left the question with the Church. Reasonable people, within each faith and outside all of them, disagree about every part of this. What the disputes prove is the point. 8 centuries after the conquest, the question of who may do what beneath the striped arches can still make headlines. These stones are not history. They are current events. There is one more thing to see before we close. In the 2000s, archaeologists opened windows in the mosque floor, and today you can stand on glass and look down at the mosaics of the Christian-era buildings excavated below. While the cathedral rises through the Islamic arches above you, Rome is down there too, in the city's foundations, out of sight but holding everything up, the way it has held everything up since chapter 1. Stand in that spot, and you are standing inside the entire argument of this story. It is time to say what the argument means. Chapter 13. The Forest of Columns. Come back into the building one last time. Early morning, before the crowds, when the light through the doorways lies down in long stripes across the floor and the columns march away into the dark in every direction, stand still and let the place do what it has done to visitors for 12 centuries. Multiply. Repeat. Recedi. More than 850 columns, and no two exactly alike. You know them now. You know that this one, pink marble, may have stood in a Roman building by the river when Seneca was a boy. That this capital was carved for a Visigothic-era church, perhaps San Vicente itself, whose mosaics sleep under the glass a few steps away. That these were raised by the exile who swam the Euphrates, and those by the Caliph who, the story insists, counted 14 happy days. That the bright vaulted eruption in the middle was cut by men whose own tradition remembers their emperor telling them they had destroyed something unique. That bells once hung here as lamps for 2 centuries, and that chroniclers made sure the world knew how they went home. Every column is a witness statement. The building is the deposition of an entire civilization. Now you can read its testimony. At the beginning, we called Córdoba the mirror of Jerusalem. Here is what the mirror shows. Jerusalem is 3 faiths on one sacred rock, each claiming the same holy ground, and much of its history is the history of that claim. Córdoba was never holy ground. It was a river crossing, a market, a payroll. Its 3 communities did not share a rock. They shared an economy, a bureaucracy, a city, and for a long moment they shared them better than anyone else on their continent. Jerusalem shows what happens when coexistence is nearly impossible and people attempt it anyway. Córdoba shows something less famous and more useful. What happens when coexistence is possible? Works, pays for itself in libraries and surgeons and lamplit streets, and is then lost anyway, because it was lost twice. And both times the first blows came from inside. The caliphate was not conquered from abroad. It broke in the Fitna, torn apart by succession crises and armies that answered to factions instead of to the state, while its enemies watched in amazement and then joined in. Convivencia did not die at the conquest of 1236. It survived under new masters for another century and a half, and was then dismantled by plague-era fear, by mobs and the preachers who aimed them, by a monarchy that built unity out of uniformity. Twice this city built a world where difference produced wealth. Twice that world was destroyed, not primarily by the weak in their moments of rage, but by the powerful in their moments of fear. That is one reading of a long and contested history. And it is the reading this story has argued for. Coexistence is infrastructure. It is built. It is maintained. And when the maintenance stops, it fails the way a bridge fails. Suddenly, after years of ignored cracks, but the deposition of the columns does not end in failure. And neither will we, because the other half of the testimony is stranger and brighter. Nothing here stayed destroyed. The library burned and scattered, and the saddlebags of refugees carried its fire into the universities of Europe. The philosopher died in disgrace and became the commentator, argued with by Aquinas, honored by Dante. The boy who fled at 10 became one of the greatest Jewish minds in history, healing the household of a Muslim sultan, signing himself the Spaniard until the day he died, a caliph's daughter, left with nothing when her dynasty fell, kept the poetry of Córdoba alive in a private room while the palaces burned. The shining city sank under its hill, and rose again under archaeologists' brushes. The crops of Andalusi gardens crossed an ocean and ended up in Florida orange groves. Córdoba lost everything, repeatedly, and its inheritance kept escaping the fires. Because ideas, unlike cities, can run. Even the building refused every ending assigned to it. It survived the conquest. The construction cut through its heart. The wars, the neglect, and one August night in 2025, the flames, two faiths took turns holding the pen here. Each destroyed part of what it found, and each, in the end, stopped short of destroying the rest. What survives is not a monument to either of them. It is a monument to the fact of each other. A room where civilizations that fought for 8 centuries stand locked in permanent conversation, holding up the same roof. The men who built it from borrowed stones were solving a supply problem. They ended up building one of the most honest self-portraits any society has ever made. Of the more than 2 million people who came through here in a single recent year, most stayed about an hour, photographed the arches, and moved on to Seville. A few stopped in the forest and felt what you now understand, that they were standing inside an argument about whether people who believe different things can build one thing together and keep it standing. The argument has run for 12 centuries in this room. The columns answer yes. The scars in the stone answer only for as long as you maintain it. Both answers are true, and the building holds them the way it holds everything else. Together, the river still slides under the old bridge, past the ruined water wheels, the way it did when the oil ships sailed. The orange trees still stand in their rows in the courtyard, planted and replanted across the centuries in a garden first laid out by exiles. And inside, in the striped light, the forest of columns goes on doing the only thing it has ever done, holding up the roof, all of them together, none of them alike. That is Córdoba's testimony. What any city does with it, including yours, is still being decided. What to keep, what to change, and what its people are willing to build together